Our next speaker is an activist who has dedicated her career to women's empowerment. Her name is Nicole Beverly. Nicole Beverly holds a master's degree with certifications in clinical social work, school social work, and suicide prevention. She is a survivor of both domestic violence and stalking. Nicole serves as a speaker, advocate, and consultant for victims and survivors of domestic violence and stalking. She has been featured in the documentary The Return of Social Change on Huffington Post Live, Fox News, and elsewhere. Nicole is committed to bringing an end to domestic violence through education, advocacy, and empowerment. She currently lives in Ypsilanti with her sons.
Good afternoon. I'm going to start out by the real reason that I'm here speaking with you today. Adrian Lakeisha Smith, Novena Mathis, Marcus Terrell Scott, Lisa Summers, Cheryl Pilarowski, Michelle Kukluski, Teresa Lockhart, Brianne Sheridan, Teresa Janae Watts, Terrence Davion Smith, Crystal Latham, Bobby Joe Thomas, Letitia Vella, Heather Dixon, Jennifer Ann Butowski, Marcia Neubauer, Chantel Johnson-Jackson, Julina Gibson, and baby Nick Mitchell, all killed by their abusers in the past 2 months in our state of Michigan. As mentioned, I am a survivor of domestic violence and stalking. You may have read my story over the summer in the Detroit Free Press. You may have heard my interview on NPR. You may have seen or even donated to my GoFundMe account for relocation for my family. If you haven't heard my story, I'm going to give you the short version. My ex-husband, who I met in college, when I met him, charming, funny, captain of the football team, became emotionally, physically, and financially abusive towards me. I've been called every name you can imagine: fat, ugly, worthless, a bitch, told that my opinion didn't matter and that I would never find anyone who would ever love me again. I've been hit, kicked, choked, thrown to the ground, and I've had a loaded gun held to my head, loaded, unloaded, and was told all the reasons why I should be killed. Why he didn't pull the trigger that night, I do not know. He threatened to kill me if I left him, and for a long time, I did not leave him because I believed him, and I still do. I finally found the courage to leave in 2009, and the next, thank you. And the next 2.5 years consisted of threats by my ex-husband, stalking behavior, frequent 911 calls, and court dates. 2.5 years of constantly looking over my shoulder, not being able to sleep at night, and feeling helpless and frustrated with our legal system. Finally, in 2001, my ex-husband received his first aggravated stalking charge, so I was feeling better. That ended up being pled down to stalking, and he ended up on probation. His stalking and threatening behavior continued, and in 2012, he received a second aggravated stalking charge, which he pled guilty to. The judge allowed him to plead to a cobs agreement, which meant he would be out with time served. Fortunately, I made a compelling victim statement, and the judge did end up sentencing him to 15 months up to 5 years in prison. However, that meant he was up for parole every year. During the course of the last 5 years of his incarceration, the Michigan State Police have notified me that 4 separate individuals serving time with my ex-husband at 3 different correctional facilities had come forward, stating that my ex-husband was offering them money to kill myself and my children. The most recent, just this past November 2016. I was also notified that 2 more individuals had come forward with statements expressing that my husband was repeatedly making statements in prison that as soon as he was released, he was coming to my home to kill my children in front of me and torture me to death. Despite all this information, I received notification in May that no new charges would be issued against my ex-husband, and he was set to be released from prison on August 24th with 2 months of parole. That's what I said. At that point, there was a safety meeting held to plan for the worst. That included a plan for a SWAT team to come to my home and map my home, and for the sheriff's department to hold a copy of mine and my children's fingerprints for identification purposes. Let that sink in. In June, the Detroit Free Press ran my story front page, and Michigan Public Radio invited me to tell my story on Stateside. People began to take notice and become outraged and shocked at what domestic violence victims go through. Something amazing began to happen. People began to rally for my family. They began calling, writing, tweeting, and emailing Attorney General Bill Schuette about my case and asking him to step in and bring charges against my ex-husband before his release. Many people felt I was putting myself in more danger by sharing my story, or that I was crazy for thinking that anything would happen or that new charges would ever happen. But what they didn't know about me is that I'm a fighter, and I will fight to the end for my children. In early July, I learned that the Attorney General's office had agreed to look into my case. In mid-July, I received the news that the Attorney General was charging my ex-husband with 7 different felonies in 3 separate counties. So I now have 3 trials to get through in the next 4 months in 3 counties. The first of which was to begin Monday, but it unfortunately was adjourned now until March 19th. The maximum length of sentence my husband faces with these new charges is 15 years. The minimum would be no additional time served, and he would be released at the conclusion of these trials. As many of you know, we live in a society that often blames victims for their abuse. A society that questions what we do to deserve to be hit, tells us we're stupid for staying, and justifies domestic violence and domestic violence-related homicides as crimes of passion or family problems. We live in a society that believes it is simple and easy for victims to leave their abusers, and that once victims leave, they are free. If you ever hear someone say that, please tell them my story. Many believe they'll never become a victim of abuse. I never believed I would. But ladies, look around you. 1 in 3 of you will become a victim in your lifetime if you have not already. Gentlemen, 1 in 5 of you will become a victim of domestic violence if you have not already in your lifetime. Domestic violence does not discriminate gender, race, education, religion. Most states are not providing domestic violence education to teach our young people at the high school level the red flags of abusive individuals, what to do if they find themselves in an abusive relationship, or how to respond when they see it happening. That is how I ended up in this relationship. I never knew the flags. We live in a country where beds are often full at domestic violence shelters and victims are turned away, when domestic violence is the leading cause for homelessness for families. Yet our government recently cut even more funding for domestic violence programs. We live in a state that in 2015 had 120 victims of domestic violence homicide. 12 of those murder charges were pled down to manslaughter, as they were classified as lovers' quarrels, which again places some onus on the victim for their own death. 1,600 women are murdered every year in our country. That's 16,000 in 10 years. compared to the 225 individuals killed by terrorists in our country over the past 15 years. Yet the war on outside terrorism remains the focus in our country. We live in a state that currently has harsher penalties for animal abuse than domestic violence. Currently, first offense animal cruelty is a felony. First offense domestic violence is a misdemeanor. Another very important fact to note is that 5 million children witness domestic violence every year, making them 74% more likely to repeat the pattern, either as a victim or as an abuser. In closing, I propose that we honor the victims whose lives were lost over the past year, not with a single moment of silence, but instead with a year of advocacy and action. A year that we focus on education and prevention, a year that we work at educating those most at risk. You are most at risk to enter a domestic violence relationship between the ages of 16 and 24 years old. Teach them the red flags of abusive individuals and what to do if you see abuse occurring in your community. There were multiple times in the community when I was being actively abused and people walked by. Not one person stopped to help me, to ask me if I was okay or if they could step in. We need to ensure that women's lives are seen as valuable as the lives of animals by changing DV sentencing guidelines. We need a year where new laws are passed and programs are created that allow victims to feel supported and valued enough to leave their abusers for good and hold their abusers accountable. Let's honor them by volunteering at shelters and donating to local domestic violence programs and refusing to make excuses for abusers while blaming victims. I believe that if we put in the work, we will have many fewer names to be read aloud on this stage a year from now. Thank you.